Evidence against Professor Ferguson, images 50 to 113. These are the supporting images for a document comprising our evidence against Professor Ferguson of Imperial College for his ICCRT Report 9 Figure 1A, 510,000 UK deaths. Note to censors, we use only government data. If you have a problem with the results, speak to the government. These are images to support a prosecution, actual or available as required. As such, they do not purport to form a narrative in the sense of an ordinary presentation or video. Images are typically grouped by a topic. An image number is associated with each image. Each image has a slide with a smaller image and brief text to provide context, and a following slide with the image in full screen. A copy of our written testimony will be in the video description. At the time of writing, it is available at the link below. We have over 290 images at the time of writing. We'll present approximately 50 images per presentation or PDF. A link to the PDF will appear in the video description. Images are free to use and share, but we retain copyright. Images with COVID data are based on official government data. Use wisely. Attempting to misrepresent our work, either to overstate the case against the government or to discredit our work or person, may be treated as defamation. A list of the images. What data did Ferguson have access to as of March 14th, where he claimed to fit his model to data up to March 14th? Professor Ferguson chose to hang the fate of the world on 7 deaths data points. What if he had chosen the far more reasonable 21 data points? It's still not much, but it's better than 7. This is UK cases to March 14th. On log scales, we see that the contagion was already normal, curling over, so the threat of an exponential virus, ironically not promoted by Ferguson, would be entirely fictitious and fraudulent. Had cases been growing exponentially, they would have followed the straight orange line on log scales. Instead, they show a distinct curvature, the mark of a normal contagion with its reducing growth rate. We plot the critical measure, being growth, as both the day-to-day, today over yesterday, actual in pink dots, and the growth of the smooth 7-day centered average in solid purple. For a normal curve, growth declines at a constant rate, which is a straight line on log scales. So here we set the growth rate, right-hand scale, to log scales. Both axes, cases and growth, are on log scales. The descent is marked, but not perfectly linear. Ferguson claimed to do this with far less data, 7 points in deaths. We can attempt to suggest a reasonable channel for the growth to continue its normal decline. If the contagion continued normally according to the channel, growth would hit unity, peak, today same as yesterday, at the beginning of April. Two other candidates for projecting the growth trajectories would be single lines fitted to the major right-hand side and minor left-hand side outbreaks. Risky, but it will give us an indication of the order of magnitude of growth decline, the sharpness of COVID in Britain. Unsurprisingly, the first minor outbreak being over, we'd have already peaked. The second outbreak also shows that we'd already have peaked, so we've likely just experienced another minor outbreak. The growth ticks up as we continue with a third component outbreak. Notice that the gold channel contains the raw data, pink, fairly reasonably, and gives us a GDF, growth decline factor, or how fast growth declines each day, of 0.99. not an unreasonable figure for a real contagion. This is on linear scales for cases. Here is our overview of the developing contagion, with associated growth rates on log scales for cases, left-hand axis, and again log scales for growth, right-hand axis. The gold channel gives us a plausible channel for future growth, but to hang the future of the West on extrapolating from a few days in Britain is reckless in the extreme, and Ferguson claimed to do it with not 21, but just 7 data points in deaths. If we use the gold channel growth rate to project onwards from the last reported cases, we get the familiar arch of a normal curve, which we, and Ferguson from Figure 1a, consider a reasonable shape to peak for a contagion. Note the arch in dashed blue of the projection coincides with the last reported cases, blue dotted, not the 7-day average, solid blue. Projecting the curve is a simple matter given our CGF model for normal curves. A normal can be defined by a seed value, a GDF, and a rate. Reverting to linear scales to show the more familiar normal curve retaining log scales for growth, we see the scale of the projection. It is an impressively large and plausible contagion predicted from a very small start. Projected deaths would be a reasonable 3,198. However, it should be apparent that we're pinning the fate of the West on a very small stub of data. Here is the price of ignoring Hubei and Korea, and this stub is excellent by comparison to the 7 data points available for deaths. When we plot what actually happened, it looks like we fell significantly short. However, we captured a contagion at better than half, approaching 2/3 of the final contagion. That's a lot closer than exaggerating nearly 150 times, as Ferguson will do. It's a brave and very reasonable effort, but to do this when we have completed contagions in Hubei and Korea is insane. And Professor Ferguson attempted worse. There is only one reason to ignore the real world, and that is if the real world doesn't fit the narrative. We can order fit a normal to the actual first peak, and it is an excellent fit, dotted blue. The contagion was normal. And had we chosen only fractionally different parameters, 1.94 instead of 1.85 for growth, 0.9901 instead of 0.9900, we would have been perfect. A 1.9 rate, 0.9900 gold channel is perfect height a few days early. We made a very reasonable, best efforts attempt to project the contagion using the cases data to March 14th. To ignore the real world and attempt to model an exponential or quasi-exponential process from initial parameters is reckless in the extreme. We highlight the sensitivity to initial parameters by here using the lower growth rate, bottom gold line, and see a very slight projection, blue dash. The growth rate is an important factor, but far less so than the critical GDF, the rate at which growth is slowing. Yet GDF isn't even recognized by formal epidemiology or the government. Using the higher growth rate, upper gold line, and we have a projection that dwarfs the actual contagion, solid blue line at bottom, and projects a Ferguson-like 364,000 deaths. From 564 deaths to 364,000, all on a different choice of initial rate, an absurd analytical risk. Regardless of its description, the Imperial College model generates a normal curve to peak. it is engaged in a similar exercise of projecting from initial conditions to a final normal curve. The risk of doing so is well demonstrated in this exercise. In fact, Ferguson ignored not only Hubei, China and South Korea, but also UK cases. Instead, he focused on UK deaths recorded here in World Health Organization data, which requires a little attention to understand what Ferguson really had available. Very reasonably, World Health Organization appears to be a day late by comparison to e.g. Metro, the UK media, who reported 35 deaths on the 15th, which presumably referred to the 14th of March. ONS refers to 59 deaths for England and Wales by the 14th, but this may include revised data. Nevertheless, it inclines us to the Metro report of 35 deaths at the time, rather than the 10 deaths of the World Health Organization. ONS National Records of Scotland adds a further 3 deaths to the England and Wales total of 59, again potentially retroactive, but that could be tested in the media and the issue is not material given 3 versus 59. The official record for Northern Ireland deaths has the first death on the 18th, and so there are 0 deaths to add to the England and Wales plus Scotland totals. Thus, if we use official but potentially revised figures for the UK, we get 59 plus 3 equals 62 deaths to the 14th of March. Metro's report of 35 deaths was therefore more likely to reflect the figure at the time than the World Health Organization figure of 10, and Ferguson may have had access to the 62 deaths figure. The Guardian would report that for England, 16 people had died by 9th of March, including 3 that day. On the 15th of March 2020, Metro reported that 14 more people have died in the UK, and the death toll in the UK now stands at 35. We consider this to be a reasonable indicator of what Ferguson would have known as deaths to the 14th. Dropping the World Health Organization time series back to reflect UK official reports, we get yet another figure, now 116 for March 14th. Thus Ferguson may have used any figure from the likely 35 of Metro to 62 per official reports to 116 by WHO lagged back to match official reports. Case death lag, a critical fraud indicator, a necessary feature for analysing Ferguson's ICCRT Report 9. Case death lag arises from the observation that if you have X% of infected becoming ill, true cases, and Y% of cases dying, then whatever the infected curve looks like, the cases and deaths curves will look the same, but in proportion X and Y, or X times Y strictly. Thus the peak of cases corresponds to the peak of infected, and likewise the peak of death corresponds to the peak of cases and of infections. The lag indicates how long it takes people to become cases, incubation, and to die, infection to death or cases to death. Log scales have 2 beneficial effects. The curves become proportionally accurate, the same shape, and the low deaths count curve is no longer squashed to the point of being indecipherable. With only 2 axes, we can plot 2 of the 3 curves on different linear axes and achieve a similar effect, scaling the right-hand scale to the left so that the peaks are the same height and the identical nature of the curves becomes obvious. Such a chart now gives us 2 critical values. The scaling factor, infection to cases ratio here, of here 2000 to 400 or 5 to 1 or 20%. and the infection to case lag of here around 10 days, 4th of February to 14th of February. With the World Health Organization and most countries locally reporting cases and deaths, the case death lag is the critical measure. It is also a leading fraud indicator, as we know you're not supposed to die the day you're diagnosed. So here a ratio of 400 to 120 or 10 to 3 or about 30% death rate, case fatality rate or CFR, is indicated, and the barely separated curves illustrate a 3-day case death lag, implying, for illustration, that you die only 3 days after being diagnosed. Astonishingly, the UK reported that you die only 12 hours after being diagnosed. Peak cases were over 5,000 for 3 days at peak from the 8th to the 10th. Peak deaths were over 1,100 for 4 days from the 8th to the 11th, 10:30 on the 9th, the same days plus 1. When we plot the cases and deaths as 7-day centered averages, that same days and 12-hour difference looks more like 3 to 4 days, but that is an artifact of the data outside the critical peak days. Note the 20% CFR achieved by the UK. Had the UK continued as a symmetrical normal contagion, as many did, there would have been no such distortion. The symmetrical contagions are shown dotted. Fraudulent abnormal cases and deaths contagions disguise the other fraud indicator of 12 hours to death. For an illustration of a responsible nation with at least reasonable looking charts, we turn to Germany. Note the CFR of approximately 310 over 7100 equals 4.4% versus UK reporting almost exactly 20%. How did the UK kill over 4 times as many people? And Germany's case death lag is around 14 days, not 12 hours. Using Germany's reported cases and deaths, we prepared a tableau infographic with 4 panels which we'll display individually. Here we emphasize how the autofit normals, solid blue and solid red, illustrate that Germany's contagions were perfectly normal to peak and diverged to a fatter tail only after cases and deaths had already dropped 50% from peak levels. The peak-to-peak case death lag at 14 days is also consistent with the blue line to red line lag on the way up, showing that the lag was consistent, and 14 days is perfectly reasonable for what we'd expect a country to be reporting as how they managed to keep people alive. The very shape of these normal curves is a key indicator that lockdown had no effect. If lockdown occurs on the way up, you'd expect the curve to be knocked sideways suddenly and bent like a straw. No such effect occurs. The normal is invaluable, and notice here how lagging the case is normal 14 days, dash purple, we get an almost perfect fit for the deaths normal and deaths data. Germany was rational. Germany makes sense. The UK does not. From the far more reasonable to the not much more absurd. If 12 hours to die in the UK is absurd, then how about Spain, where the official records say you've actually died before you're diagnosed, the same day pretty much all the way to peak. No one can look at these cases and deaths curves and say they reflect a reasonable picture of people getting sick, ending up in hospital and then dying days later. They are fraud, pure and simple, and no one noticed. It is critical to realize that Hubei, China, the contagion Professor Ferguson ignored, was over and available even as he finalized his report and published. And it was perfectly normal with well-separated cases and deaths. The narrow cases are confirmed. Earlier cases were medically diagnosed. China didn't pretend to have people die the same day they entered hospital. It shows around 11 days separation. The death rate was not 20% UK, but 4.55%, in line with Germany's 4.36%. It wasn't China which lied, but the UK, and Spain, and the West. Korea, Republic of, again with the tight cases, likely early cases were medically diagnosed, similar to Hubei, and again with a clear separation between cases and deaths, at a remarkable 24 days, a peak death rate of 1.16% and deaths 6.7 times better than Hubei. It is impossible to look at these charts, Hubei and Korea, both of which were available as Ferguson published, deaths and cases complete in Hubei, cases complete in Korea, and not feel the anger that we have been lied to from the very beginning. Sweden back to Europe, and while it's invaluable as a no-lockdown antidote to Ferguson, that doesn't let it off the hook for its initially excellent but soon abnormal charts. Here again we see a bizarre deaths chart inside the cases chart, both showing the sideways movement that is a key fraud indicator. For interest, we can compare Sweden to the UK in a simple way that reflects how we'll examine Figure 1a, Ferguson, versus our modelling of Ferguson. We can remove the background of the Swedish chart as illustrated here, with placed background blocks showing through. First, let's formally recognise Sweden's invaluable role as no lockdown versus Ferguson, but also its disturbing fraudulent features as annotated here. Now we have the UK cases and deaths chart for reference. And we note its key abnormalities and fraud indicators in this annotated version. Beyond the CFR and case death lag, there is this remarkable phenomenon where the virus goes walkabout at peak, a feature unique to the UK and Sweden and Netherlands. This isn't just asymmetry. Anyone trying to use Gompertz, proven false in videos and in later testimony, needs also to explain this. Deaths stop following cases and just quit, heading home early. Death is bored, taking a holiday, but only in the UK. Finally, we get to overlay Sweden. We could do a formal country versus country analysis, but this is simple and also illustrates the technique we'll use with Ferguson ICCR TR9 Figure 1a, where underlying data, model output in a series, isn't available. Marrying the left-hand scale for the two figures so that we're comparing like with like, we see broadly similar stories, similar time frames, each with bizarre case death lag, and similar cases and deaths going walkabout after peak. Here's the annotated version showing walkabout in cases and walkabout in deaths for both countries. This is Imperial College COVID-19 Response Team Report 9 Figure 1a with the US curve removed. This is the chart that sent the West into lockdown. We'll need case death lag to convert Ferguson's infected in early January parameter into a deaths parameter. The chart is annotated. That's it for this package. I'm Andrew Mather, a 60-year-old Brit, mathematician, financier, technologist, husband, biker, pilot, healer, whatever. Feel free to get in touch, andrew@peerlessreads.com or andrew@amather.com. Either should get to me.